every Friday night at 8 p.m. for the next 5 weeks, we will be bringing these deep discussions and powerful presentations on health, migration, Brexit, entrepreneurship, and more to you right here on your favorite Unmute Now podcast channel. On today's episode, Dr. Lisa Claire Whitten talks about Brexit, racism, and strengthened rights. Dr. Whitten is a research fellow whose dissertation focused on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Prior to her PhD, Dr. Whitten worked in the political and public sectors, including in Westminster and in Brussels. Who better to clarify the intricacies of Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and its impact on racism, as well as improvements in human rights provisions? As we hear the efforts to address the deep concerns at Stormont, Dr. Whitten outlines the complexity of Northern Ireland's politics and geography. Remember now to like, share, and subscribe to Unmute Now as we keep raising the volume on the whispered conversations in our community.
We're going to go into some detail about Brexit and how it's played out here in Northern Ireland, because if you've been living here the last number of years, we've all kind of been swimming in it a little bit. It's going to have come across your path, Brexit, Northern Ireland, and all the drama. So hopefully I'm going to explain that to you, but also towards the end, give you some tools and some information around the rights that have been impacted by Brexit, but also the rights that you have as a consequence of it and of the way that it's played out here. So hopefully, yes, we're crashing into Brexit. It's a Saturday morning after such an entertainment, but I hope it's going to be useful, and not just today, but in future. So if you can go with me on that, amazing. The second, I do just want to put a disclaimer, because when we talk about this stuff, and particularly when I get to talk about the impact of Brexit on attitudes of race and racist activities and crimes and incidents, I'm really aware that I'm like one of the whitest humans God makes as an Irish, and I can't escape that. I can't get outside my own context. And you guys have to face this stuff and deal with these issues in a way that I don't have to. And I'm just really aware of that. And I feel like I want to learn from you as much as I'm going to give you a whole load of chat about Brexit and its impact here. So those are my two disclaimers. Sorry that we're talking about Brexit. And number two, teach me as much as I want to give you some tools here. Okay. First, going to look at how we got here, where we are, and then what it means / why any of it matters. So in terms of how we got here, what did Brexit mean? What did it mean for Northern Ireland? Why did it create so much drama here? I'm sure you've seen graffiti and stuff. Have you seen graffiti about Brexit and all up around the place? Why is that? Why has it been so disruptive here? Why has it been so tense? And then where are we now? Like, what's happening in terms of our government and the impact and how it's playing out? And then we'll look at what it might mean going forward, and particularly what are the specific impacts for Black minority ethnic communities as a consequence of Brexit. Sounds fun. We'll do it. Okay. First of all, what did Brexit mean for Northern Ireland? Has anyone heard of the protocol? Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, right. So by the end of this session, you guys are going to be more educated and read up on the protocol than the majority of people who talk about it, I would suggest. And we'll look at why it exists and why it's been so disruptive. Yes. So what did Brexit mean? Right. European integration, EU membership. When a country joins the EU and they decide to opt in to the ever closer union of European integration, one of the consequences of that is that the borders between the countries get softer, and we mean goods, people, money, services can flow more freely, i.e. you can go without getting passport checks to Europe, free travel, all that stuff. You can go set up life, you can do Erasmus, all of that good stuff. But one of the Impacts of that, so softer borders between states, is that the borders on the outside of EU members gets harder because, in a sense, those borders are carrying more weight than an ordinary interstate border generally does. So they have to do more of the checks, more of the controls need to be implemented there because the countries that are within the European Union have opted in to have a common visa policy, common customs staff, common rules about the way the state operates. So the borders on the outside get, we talk about, harder, which means the checks are more burdensome. And there's more administration there, and it's harder to travel as a person. So how does that match to Brexit? The Brexit project, the referendum in 2016, a lot of the narratives were about taking back control. So the UK state and the campaign for Leave talked a lot about regaining control of the laws and the borders that apply in the UK. And kind of like pulling back some of that softening of the borders and the rearranging of borders that had happened as a consequence of EU membership. So implementing Brexit was always going to mean reassessing the borders of the UK and making them harder. So making the checks stronger, more burdensome, and that was a reality of Brexit. That's what take back control was going to mean. And that's what being a non-EU member state was going to mean. Okay, so why does this matter for Northern Ireland? Go to the next slide. Love it. So Northern Ireland, in the context of the UK, has unique circumstances in the context of Brexit. So in that project of taking back control, because of Northern Ireland's position, it was always going to be a bit particular, a bit different, a bit harder here. Why? Well, the first reason is really obvious. Just geographically, Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK that shares a land border with another EU member state. And that process of like softening borders between EU member states always goes faster at land borders because basically humans are better at walking across land borders than they are better than sea borders, right? So the integration process that goes faster along the land border. It's always going to be messier and more complex. Then also added into that in Northern Ireland, you have this historic and political complexity around borders. So the history of Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland has been defined by conflict over borders, about what they mean, about what identities they bestow on us. So the land border here has long been even more challenging than an ordinary land border. And that process of integration, 1998, the Good Friday Agreement, one of the things that it introduced was a possibility of faster integration between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and north-south element, which allowed for things like cooperation on healthcare, on police and judicial cooperation, tourism, education, like lots of kind of daily life issues that have a north-south dynamic. So again, thinking back to Brexit and taking back control for the island of Ireland, not only was that hardening of the border process going to have to operate on a land border uniquely in Northern Ireland, but it was going to have to do it in the context of there being unique circumstances that allowed for greater integration, like the detangling was going to be more complex here even than it would have been between France and Germany because they have a land border. Do you know what I mean? So, and that's before we even mention the politics of it and the personal and lived experience of communities on the border on the island of Ireland. So both sides, both the UK and the EU, recognised from the beginning that Northern Ireland had unique circumstances. Yeah, if you can flick through this one. I guess just to emphasise that the border along here, land border. I'm sure you guys have travelled like from Belfast to Dublin, Donegal. It's really hard to notice. The border kind of doesn't exist. So you have the kind of practical reality of it. 300-kilometre long border. It was never meant to be an interstate border. It was a border between counties. It goes through people's homes on occasions. It crosses rivers, like it winds and everything. So if you're going to implement the hardness that's required to be the border of the EU along here, logistically, looking at it, it kind of isn't possible, or we don't have the technology developed yet to make it work. And that's before you look at the history. So this is, there used to be customs posts on the border, and there used to be military outposts on the border as a consequence of the conflict. The border, when you look at the vote in 2016 around the referendum of Brexit, all of the border communities, they had some of the highest votes for Remain. So one of the challenges is if you were going to implement a really rigorous border regime that involves like drones and technology and checking and all of that, people there didn't want it, let alone we don't have the technology to implement it. So what do you do? In the negotiations, you're amazing at this, thank you. You're like reading my mind. So it came up with the UK government in their negotiating priorities and the EU's negotiating priorities. When you read them together, this is what became known as the Brexit Trilemma. So the UK and the EU had both committed to not try to implement a physical hard border on the island of Ireland for logistical, historical, and political reasons. And they didn't think it was going to secure the EU markets. They just didn't think it was going to work. Promise number, so that was, okay, that's promise number 3, but hey, we'll go with it. Promise number 1 up there, that was the UK government's aim to take back control. So this is the Brexit narrative, the idea that the UK is going to take like control back and be a stronger state, independent. So they want to leave the EU single market and leave the EU customs union. So they talk about that as like a hard Brexit, because that would require more checks, more trade friction, and more kind of lived friction between people travelling between the EU and the UK. But that was the vision of Brexit, as was pursued by the UK government at the time. Then promise number 2 over there was that there would also be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, right? Because they didn't want that because Northern Ireland is part of the UK. The thing is, you can't do all 3 of those things and still operate in the world that we live in, that operates with like global trade, and checks go somewhere and rules have to apply and someone has to check that they're being applied. So they started to talk about this as unicornology. It's really paraphrase, but to get to the middle center of D. So what happened? Well, I'm not going to revise all of the messy politics of Brexit, but to summarise, Theresa May, so if you flick on her approach, this is her resigning, which I look so upset. Her approach was to compromise on the nature of Promise 1. So the UK as a whole would have a hard Brexit, but it wasn't like really hard. They would still have free access to the EU market. They would still follow some of the rules, and they would still be a close like trading neighbour. And it couldn't pass her party. So the Conservative Party, and particularly strong and powerful group in the Conservative Party, didn't think this was Brexit. This wasn't fulfilling the vision of taking back control. So they opposed all of this. Some in the Northern Ireland also opposed it, the DUP, because they felt there would have been differentiation for Northern Ireland, even within Theresa May's plan. So they said no to that, even though there was less differentiation than the next plan. Speaking of, in came Boris Johnson. And he did it differently. He compromised on the Promise 2 thing. So he said, Well, what Boris Johnson said and then what Boris Johnson did, different things. So he agreed a protocol that provided for Northern Ireland to leave on different terms to the rest of the UK in the Brexit process. Crucially, again, just thinking how this plays out, the Boris Johnson plan wasn't, at the time, if the UK as a whole kept a close relationship with EU as a whole, the protocol, so the different arrangement for Northern Ireland, wouldn't have been so dramatic, but he really went for the top one, the leaving the single market and the customs union. So we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so that's basically Brexit. This is what it gifted us, a protocol. Yay! So what's the protocol? It is a compromise between those three different aspects. It provides for no hard border on the island of Ireland, and Northern Ireland continues to have free access to the whole of the EU single market, unlike GB, but as a consequence, the corollary is checks and controls need to be carried out on the sea border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. I'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. So the protocol, this is it. Isn't it lovely? It's a legal text. It's part of a treaty between the UK and the EU. The withdrawal agreement. It has 19 articles, 7 annexes, and its aim, in its own words, is to address the unique circumstances on the island of Ireland, to maintain necessary conditions, so those aspects of like cooperation, north-south, healthcare, education, tourism, all of that. It aims to allow those to continue, and to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland and protect the 1998 agreement. That's what it says. It's contested as to whether or not it achieves that. So this slide, I'm going to try and do this really quickly because this goes through all of the 19 articles, which I do think, well, anytime I do this, we're in a strange political situation where a legal text that is normally like a niche interest for lawyers and geeks is really central and is being graffitied about, and is like, has really disrupted our government and the place that we live. So I do think sometimes it's useful to get a sense of what it actually means and what it actually does, rather than just how it's spoken about. So that's my justification for taking you through a slide with 19 little small boxes. So very quickly, Article 1 states that the objectives of the protocol that we've just outlined to address the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland. Article 2, which I'm going to speak about more as we close, provides certain guarantees for the rights of individuals, to uphold those in the context of Brexit. Article 3 makes provision for the common travel area that exists between the UK and Ireland, which is quite a unique arrangement between two countries, but existed before EU membership and allows for free travel between Great Britain and Ireland. So it allows that to continue. Article 4 says that Northern Ireland remains fully within the UK customs territory, and this is where we get into a little bit of fudge territory, kind of saying one thing but maybe playing out in a different way. Article 5 says that although Northern Ireland is fully in the UK customs territory, the EU customs code is going to apply to it in respect of goods, which is kind of they call it constructive ambiguity. Use it in conflicted situations. Article 6 says, makes provision around the protection of the UK internal market, says that this protocol will be applied to the extent possible. It will allow for the free flow of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, albeit making provision for the application of the EU customs code and EU rules to Northern Ireland. We'll go with it. Article 7 is probably candidate for the most geeky. It introduces a trademark for Northern Ireland goods to flow into the EU single market. It's called UKNI. makes a couple of provisions around certification and regulation of goods. So when we're talking about this stuff, this is about the standards. So how do you guarantee that that chair has been made to the level that is required in law so that when you sit on it, it doesn't collapse under you? That's what we're talking about across a whole range of areas. Article 9 Article 8 is around VAT and excise, which is kind of just one of those things that follows global trade now. If you're trading in goods, you need to be VAT registered and know about all that stuff. Again, bit niche. Article 9, single electricity market. So on the island of Ireland, the grid, just basically because we're a small place, we operate our electric grid and our energy markets are pretty, they operate in the same physical grid. Again, it's back to that geographic point, and they're regulated together. There's a joint regulation system. So in order to keep our lights on and our Macs and presenters flowing, this Article 9 allows that to happen in the context of Brexit because the UK is coming out of the EU system for energy and electricity. Article 10, state aid, again pretty nice, basically the laws around what government sponsoring of any initiative following trade. Again, it's that VAT and excise, it goes with if you're trading goods, often there's state aid implications in law and in international trade. Article 11 is on other areas of North-South cooperation, so those areas that aren't specifically covered when it relates to trading goods, your tourism, your education, your sport, crime and justice, all of that stuff. Article 12 and 13, and then I'm going to go 16 and 17, are all about the way this thing is going to be enforced. So the laws that are around it, who checks that it's being done, that the laws this makes applicable are actually being implemented. And the controversial thing to note in that is that it gives the EU court and the EU legal system jurisdiction in Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland under this protocol is continuing to have access to the EU single market, and EU rules around goods apply under Article 5 specifically. So, but that is politically controversial, as we will see. Article 14 and Article 15 set up dedicated committees to talk about the implementation of this and how it's affecting people on the ground. And then Article 18, just at the bottom there, is around the democratic consent mechanism, which you haven't heard much chat about, but may come to the fore again, or may come to the fore in future, because it allows for the Northern Ireland Assembly to take votes every 4 or 8 years on whether or not they want the main body of this stuff to continue to apply in Northern Ireland. So the first vote on that is due Christmas 2024. What a gift. Right. Thank you for enduring that. Congrats. So what impact has Brexit and the protocol had on Northern Ireland? Okay, we talked about our sea border. It's created an Irish sea border, and that's why you see graffiti about it all over the show, because again, back on that compromise, checks and controls need to be implemented at the ports and airports in Northern Ireland in a way that they haven't before. And also because of the arrangement made for the UK as a whole with the EU as a whole, the trade controls between the UK as a whole and the EU are really much harder. So the whole take back control narrative, that's the realization of it. Have you seen anything in the news over the summer around queues, the Dover ports and traveling across, all of that? That's the implementation of Brexit, and the requirements now, because they don't share rules anymore, stuff needs to be checked. And some of that, it's not to the same extent as the UK EU GB EU border, but for GB to NI, because goods are regulated in Northern Ireland to EU standards and they're not anymore in the UK GB context. The Irish sea border, the ports of Belfast and the airports are now in effect they're not full, the border of the EU single market because they're not for services and stuff. This is a compromise, but they are holding that weight of like the hardness of the outside of an EU market, right? So this is politically controversial, and that's a nice little diagram that says more eloquently what I just said. So how did this play out? January 2021, there was evident disruption. One of the issues is that the arrangements between the UK as a whole, and particularly UKGB and the EU, were agreed at the very last minute. So, for example, Christmas Eve, I think, is when they actually signed a text to say this is what's going to happen between the UK government and the EU. But what that also meant, because of the protocol, was that was also signing the text that would say how this was going to play out for Northern Ireland. And that was Christmas Eve. It was signed. It was passed in the two parliaments, or in the UK Parliament, New Year's Eve, or just before New Year's Eve. And it had to go live on the 1st of January 2021. So traders here, businesses here, the last notification came to them was about parcels, which is not a small thing if you're a business here. So the rules on what was going to happen to parcels going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland came through at 11:45 p.m. on the 31st of December 2020, and it was law in 15 minutes, and they were going to have to implement it and comply with it. So tricky. And it took effect, and there were delays, and the systems are still getting better. They are now smoother, but this was the first effect. And politically, that was kind of important because the implementation of the Irish Sea border is contentious here in Northern Ireland, particularly because it's felt to the Unionist Loyalist community as a violation of their Britishness and a threat to Northern Ireland's place within the UK. And so the evidence in supermarket shelves of not having goods, that particularly in the 1st of January and in the early months of that year, really was like a felt reality of this kind of political move that they already felt was a betrayal. That's the narrative that's used in the Unionist Loyalist community. So the disruption had political implications, although today what we see is that it has become a lot smoother. And these are some figures that don't feel that you have to zoom right in and look at in detail, but what they say is that Northern Ireland GDP as a region within the UK is actually doing better, or has done better, and part of that is a protective impact of the continued access of Northern Ireland goods to trade with the EU single market, because it's a big place. And yeah, this was just on. Thanks again, reading perfect. So in tune. So in the early months, that graph on the right, you just see kind of a jump up in all of those figures. This is from the Northern Ireland Chamber of Commerce. So it's businesses here saying whether or not they found it difficult to adapt to the new Brexit arrangements. And essentially what you see is that yes, they did, but they are now adapting to it. The majority are now adapted well to it. And that's not to say that there aren't issues, right? So this is like all of the UK ministers that have been involved. And it's not even up to date at all, because they change literally like day to day. But the implementation of the protocol has been controversial, not just in Northern Ireland, but between the UK and the EU. And the UK government have accused the EU of implementing it in a way that's too rigorous, and the EU have accused the UK of not implementing it, which, to be fair, they kind of haven't. But so they've started talks, and talks are ongoing. They haven't really figured it all out yet. So what are they talking about? There are some issues so I did say that it's gotten smoother, the arrangements have gotten smoother. Um, but this is an untested system. Like Brexit has never been done before. And the implementation of this kind of protocol arrangement, like it is niche and it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Um, and it has raised issues that weren't fully thought through. Also in part because, as I just said, like the arrangements for UK trade as a whole with the EU only came into play a year afterwards, and we had no time to like smooth out what was clearly going to be disruptive impacts. So, um, I'll not go through all of these. Basically, like you may have heard stuff about pets, you may have heard stuff around, there was a big sausage thing for a while, about cold meats. There's also like plants, potatoes. I mean, the stuff that I've learnt about doing this job in the last number of years, I'd never imagined. Um, and it's interesting, I guess, to look at the UK government's medicines as well. I should say medicines was a big one. But they have actually agreed, so the EU changed their laws to allow for Northern Ireland route in to ease what would have been really quite disruptive impact on medicine supply here. So that one has largely kind of been ticked off and addressed. Issues still are there around customs, and then the UK want to change the terms of enforcement. So they want to have the EU court not applying, um, which for anyone like EU lawyers, that's like, say what? Because EU law applies here. And so it's like, but if the court should implement that. So they're still talking, sort of, sometimes. Just moving to look a bit more specifically about the political impact here. As I said, it hasn't been great. So the implementation of an Irish sea border for Unionist loyalist communities has really felt like a threat to the position of Northern Ireland within the UK, and like a dilution of their British identity. And the compromise that was made around implementing checks and controls, they think is not valid. And so there's been a series of organised protests against it. And we did see a period of rioting in April 2021 that wasn't purely about the protocol, but that was a factor there. And throughout that time and the series of public marches and ongoing political protest and mobilisation against the Irish sea border and the protocol, and should say that has been part of the push on the UK government to pursue more talks with the EU. We can debate their strategies, but there is something to be, I think the point ought to be made that the mobilisation of Unionist loyalist communities here and Unionist politicians here has influenced the UK government's policy and position. In terms of our government and the government, or lack of government at the minute, so Jeffrey Donaldson, leader of the DUP, the DUP pulled out of the Northern Ireland Executive earlier this year in protest against the protocol and its implementation and the lack of movement on making it, of changing those arrangements. Northern Ireland has a power sharing government system, part of the peace agreement here, so it requires unionists and nationalists to be involved and to agree in order to progress. And that does make the institutions really vulnerable to collapse. And so actually 40% of the time, and it's kind of going up, but that they've existed, they haven't actually been in operation. And it's maybe also just worth saying, like dealing with something like the complexity of implementing Brexit and the untested system of the protocol, and all of the changes required is harder in a power sharing system. because you're gonna rely on the level of compromise or ability of the two extremes to compromise. So it's been a really disruptive, had a really disruptive impact in Northern Ireland politics and our institutions. And some of what's ongoing at the minute, I went to update this slide last night and thought, I just like, where would you stop? Yeah. So some developments just to flag in UK EU talks, they kind of broke down recently. They're now in a better place, but quite recently they broke down because the Northern Ireland or the UK government introduced the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which proposes to disapply in UK law what applies under the protocol that they signed up to, and it would remove some of its effects. Worth saying that when you look at the detail of that bill, really it's giving UK ministers a whole lot of power to affect what's happening. It's not disapplying the protocol, although that is kind of how it's being messaged, which again for Northern Ireland politics is problematic because you're putting out there that you can promise to take this all away, but you're not, and you're kind of acting like you are, but you're not really. So we'll see how this plays out. The EU, in response, because of the arrangements that exist between the UK and the EU, they can take infringement proceedings like legal action because the UK is proposing to go back on their word and what they said. So again, talks ongoing. We'll see what happens. I'm going to leave it there in terms of where we are. And then I just want to spend the last 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes talking about why any of this matters and how it might impact specifically on Black communities in Northern Ireland and rights and access. And in this section, Brexit's impact on levels of societal peace, tolerance and upholding of the rule of law and justice. Honestly, you can't sugarcoat it. It hasn't been great. And the data does show that this next slide kind of gives just an example that levels of racist incidents and race crimes and experiences of racial discrimination across the UK did go up. And this is it's a societal phenomenon that you see when you study this stuff in general, that when at a high political level, you have a strengthening of kind of exclusionary discourse, of nationalist discourse, and a sense of kind of a greater sense of the other, whoever that is, in political language, that you do often see an increase in crimes and discrimination, because it's like a permissibility effect. I wish it was other, but it wasn't, and it isn't. But it's not totally without hope. Just to say, in Northern Ireland, we have seen the same trend, and specifically, if you can look, this is PSNI statistics, and around the implementation of the protocol in 2021, there was a real jump in incidents of racist racial discrimination and criminal acts. So you are seeing that the fear and the mobilisation and anger in society has this effect, and I'm really sorry for it. But, right, one of the impacts of Brexit specifically and the Northern Ireland's history more generally is that Northern Ireland has a unique relationship to rights law, and kind of the Constitution of Northern Ireland puts rights more central than in the rest of the UK. And this was recognised in the protocol in the context of Brexit. So Article 2 provides guarantees for the rights of individuals, and it puts an obligation on the UK government to ensure that there is no diminution in rights as a consequence of Brexit, that UK citizens had pre-Brexit. So it links it to two kind of documents that I'll flag in the next two slides, but it includes in the area of protection of discrimination, and it also gives power to bodies here, rights bodies here, to make sure the UK government are upholding this stuff. So this is the this is the tool that you have to push back against the real weight of negativity that comes with Brexit. So I clearly had fun on the animations last night. Right, so yes, as I said, it links, so that Article 2 gives us all as citizens in Northern Ireland specific protections for a series of rights, and those rights exist in two documents. So first in the 1998 agreement, and under the 1998 agreement, together with Article 2 of the Protocol and some UK law that's implemented it, these are the rights that are upheld, right? So right of free political thought, right to freedom and expression of religion, right to pursue democratically national and political aspirations, the right to seek constitutional change by peaceful and legitimate means. This was the 1998 agreement. The right to freely choose one's place of residence. That one's actually quite interesting in the context of Brexit and may come to the fore in some case law just because of free movement issues and stuff. The right to equal opportunity. I've put this one in bold, in all social and economic activity, regardless of class, creed, disability, gender, or ethnicity. So again, that's particular tool to push back against any racial discrimination experienced. The right to freedom from sectarian harassment, the right of women to full and equal political participation, the right of victims to remember as well as to contribute to a changed society, again, context, conflict, respect, understanding and tolerance in relation to linguistic diversity. I think it's fair to say Northern Ireland's still working on that one. And a lot of these things. Oh, and one more. The need to ensure that symbols and emblems are used in a manner which promotes mutual respect rather than division. As an aside, that one honestly kind of vaguely makes me laugh because, I mean, we literally paint curbs here. Anyway, those rights under the protocol, actually as a kind of positive, they now have greater force of law than they did before the protocol and before Brexit, because more powers have been given to rights bodies here to make sure the UK government are upholding those rights. As well, Article 2 links in its other thing when it was written out, links to Annex 1 of the protocol. Again, this is like niche legal text stuff, but there are 6 directives under Annex 1 that, again, it's good. I think it's useful to know that these protections exist in law. So if you ever experience any discrimination or incident, this is what you can push back with to fight that and correct it. So the majority of them are in relation to employment and gender equality in employment, and requirement for equal treatment for social security matters, access to social security. But then the one that is specifically useful to know of for Black community and other minorities is the Racial Equality Directive that requires the principle of equal treatment of persons irrespective of racial or ethnic origin. So again, for Northern Ireland, while this existed pre-Brexit, because the protocol in Article 2 required new powers of enforcement and oversight to rights bodies here that are independent of government, it actually does mean that these rights and the 1998 agreement rights have been strengthened as a consequence of Brexit. So it's one of the very few silver linings for here to see. And what are those bodies that I've just talked about? So the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission have an obligation to monitor, like I swear, we're so in tune. Monitor, advise, inform, and represent. So they are obligated to monitor what the UK government are doing in terms of making law across all areas, and to make sure that those laws they're making don't violate any of those rights under Annex 1 or under the 1998 agreement, and or that there isn't right variation between rights being upheld in Ireland and in Northern Ireland. And what that means is that there's an obligation for Northern Ireland in a certain section of rights law to continue to follow EU developments. The Equality Commission, Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission are also meant to advise UK ministers. Whether or not the UK ministers listen, still working on that. But they are advising and they are raising issues that are coming to the fore in terms of legal developments in the UK. So that is good to see, a level of accountability and a mechanism for accountability. They're also due to inform the UK population or Northern Ireland population of these rights that do exist. And also they can represent you in legal proceedings and or give legal advice to anyone on the basis of whether or not they've experienced this sort of stuff. So that's me.